The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. MassMutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a MassMutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code THEATHLETIC, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code THEATHLETIC. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code THEATHLETIC and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Mika Hakkinen's final season in F1 wasn't particularly memorable, but one moment that stood out was the heartbreaking way he lost the 2001 Spanish Grand Prix, which he appeared to have in the bag until the very last lap. Hakkinen's dramatic breakdown summed up a day to forget for McLaren, where teammate David Coulthard's car stalled before the formation lap, leading to Ron Dennis's famous and inaccurate claim that the Scot suffered brain fade in the cockpit. I'm Glenn Freeman, and joining me to revisit the day Michael Schumacher limped home to victory ahead of first-time podium finisher Juan Pablo Montoya and Jacques Villeneuve claimed BAR's first F1 podium are Mark Hughes and Matt Beer. Those of you who listen to the very end of our episodes to find out what the next one is might be wondering why we're not talking about the Walrus Williams of 2004 as we promised, but I can assure you that's been shuffled back just a week, so you'll hear that next time. So Mark, looking at Spain 2001 instead, a race you were at, of course, when you think back to this weekend, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
It was just that moment. It was getting towards the end of the race. Mika had a big lead, 40 seconds or something like that. And it was just coming up to the beginning of the last lap. And I'd stood up ready to head straight down to the paddock. And then I heard an engine go past the start-finish straight, which is, as you know, just outside, adjacent to the media center. And there was a very, very sick-sounding engine. In among all these the high-pitched V10s, there was something that came past, just gurgling and a very nasty, horrible, low-pitched sound. And I looked to say, "Oh, who's that?" And I looked out the window, and of course, it was Mika. So the race leader, and he stopped soon after. So yeah, big drama. 59th minute, the 11th hour sort of thing.
Yeah, crushing for Mika, really, and we'll get into it in lots of detail later on. Matt, have we left anything on the table for you to pick for the traditional opening question?
It'd be a lie if I said it was the first thing that came into mind, because that's a very obvious first thing for this race. But Alonso beating the Benettons is the second thing in my head for this one. One of those very early signs of just how special Alonso was going to be and how bad Benetton had got very quickly at the start of 2001.
Yeah, that Benetton was absolutely dreadful, and we'll come back to that as well. Before we get going, remember to get your questions in for our series finale using the hashtag BringBackV10s on Twitter, or email bringbackv10s@the-race.com, or you can leave us a 5-star podcast review on Apple Podcasts and submit a question there too. And if you'd like to get early access to ad-free versions of the show, plus exclusive bonus content between series, then sign up to the Race Members Club to get a range of special benefits. Check out the-race.com/members club to find out more. The big talking point in F1 heading into this weekend back in 2001 was the return of electronic driver aids for the first time since they were banned at the end of 1993. Traction control, launch control and automatic gears were once again legal, primarily because the FIA felt it was becoming too difficult to police what the teams were doing. McLaren boss Ron Dennis addressed this aspect of the unban, saying racing purists criticise this move, but it's far more important for F1 to get rid of the suspicion that surrounded this. So Mark, under those circumstances, was it the right thing to do to legalise these gizmos, or should the FIA have just worked harder and spent more of its own money on trying to clamp down on what it was believed some teams were doing?
I think at the time it was the correct practical decision, and while they worked away at a longer term one, which eventually would come with a standardized ECU. But it's actually a much smaller deal than was being made of it. It's nice to have the drivers control the traction and to know that that's what they're doing, but that hadn't really been the differentiating factor between who's quick or slow for about 30 years. Anybody at that level could do it. It was relatively easy. It maybe not in the wet, but the absolute fundamental, it had once been in the day of Fangio, so the absolutely fundamental key to who was quick and who wasn't. But by the time you got big downforce and big tyres, it wasn't any big test of driver ability, not at this level. The difficult bit was how much speed could be taken into the corner in the corner entry, and this had nothing to do with that. So in order to get rid of the suspicion that some were cheating, the FIA just took the rule away, because the policing methods weren't up to detecting the difference between traction control and torque mapping, where the traction control reacts to the onset of wheel spin, whereas the torque mapping was just reducing torque just before it sensed the wheels were about to spin, and you're talking of a difference of a hundredth of a second or something. So it was a huge fuss about nearly nothing that had some traditionalists up in arms, but only because they hadn't grasped what had been happening for years. It really wasn't a big deal.
In a moment, we'll come to one very high-profile supporter of driver aids returning. But first, let's tackle what some of the dissenters thought of this rule change. Jean Lacey called it a disaster that would destroy the show, adding that the sound of traction control kills your brain and sounds awful. He's certainly right that they sounded terrible. He reckoned his grandmother could drive an F1 car without a problem now. Giancarlo Fisichella said F1 was better without the driver aids, which he felt made the car more important than the driver. But like Ron Dennis said, he added, if some teams were cheating before with these systems, it's better that we're all equal. Eddie Irvine wasn't shy about his feelings. He said, I think it's totally wrong for Formula One. It's good for me because I get paid the same amount and I don't have to work as hard. But you need about the same amount of skill as walking into a room and turning on the lights. The technicians put in the effort. They fiddle with their numbers. I just press the throttle. Matt, from more of a perhaps fan perspective back then, how did you feel about driver aids being legalised? Were you what Mark described earlier as a purist who was up in arms?
I think the main thing at that time was I just felt it was embarrassing for F1 to have to go, we just can't control this, so whatever, just get on with it because we can't detect them, we can't police it. It seemed like a failure of officiating as much as anything else. And I think also it was only 8 years since they'd been banned before, which is relatively recent. And the noise around them being banned, along with active suspension and all the other gizmos in '93, was this is making it too easy for the drivers. So they were kind of made to be a big, bad, spooky thing. All the drivers saying this is so easy, we can now just put our foot flat down and not lift it for the entire lap. That was how they were kind of portraying this change. So it did come across. It came across very negatively, even if I think at that point. I was a couple of years into doing bits and bobs of freelance, and I think even I noticed at that point that most people were running some kind of traction control substitute, and pit stops were a little bit curious with pit limiters coming on and off and that sort of thing. Jordan's famous trick in '99 was around a kind of false traction control. So, yeah, I didn't think it was going to be game changing, but I did think it was massively embarrassing because all the drivers were slating it, and it was allowing something that they just said we can't police, and we took it away 8 years ago because it was terrible, but you've got to have it back.
I think it's perhaps telling that all those drivers who were so far against it and said it made their lives so easy. None of them became dominant forces in F1 when it all came back. So we've already had a Lacey saying his grandmother could drive an F1 car, and Irvine saying there's no skill involved. One of Irvine's bosses at Jaguar, Niki Lauda, claimed F1 cars were so easy to drive, even a monkey could drive one. Michael Schumacher, of all people, took issue with that, saying we must be 22 very good monkeys in the cars now. Maybe a monkey could drive the cars, but certainly not as fast. Schumacher was the driver most vocal in favour of driver aids returning. He said, I am in favour of it. We can go faster with it and drive more on the limit. It gives us more freedom to drive a bit faster. The ability to take the car permanently to the limit is what makes a good driver. He also cited the very apt example of Williams teammates Nigel Mansell and Riccardo Patrese in 1991 and 92. They were pretty evenly matched for much of their first season together. Then when driver aids were added to the Williams FW14B for 1992, Mansell destroyed Patrese, and Schumacher said, this is because you had to go more to reach the limit of the car. Mark, does that give us a glimpse into how Schumacher's brain was wired up differently from a lot of his rivals?
Yeah, it shows that he properly understood the dynamics and where there was speed to be found from himself. Because in that search, which he'd conducted more intensely and scientifically than any driver before, from the moment he arrived, he found without any question which were the differentiating parts of the corner. And you can hear many of his rivals hadn't worked that out. And for sure, traction control made driving the car physically easier, but there was a key to being fast with traction control, and Schumacher had already worked this out as well. His speed came from taking an outrageous degree of speed into the corner and then having the fine hold feel to sit on the edge immediately, then make no further input until it was stabilized sort of around about the apex. And conventionally, that would make you later on the power and slower on the exit, so sort of fast in, slow out. But he managed to be fast in and fast out because he could manipulate the throttle in that awkward phase of transition, because driving with traction control meant you could just put your foot on the floor, yes, and some imagines that they'd all be able to now drive like Michael and fast in and fast out, but they absolutely could not. Traction control opened up an area advantage for him, because now the car would be at its quickest with an optimum amount of traction control, not full traction control. Full traction control made it easy, but that wasn't the quickest way. So now the art became about finding what the optimum was, and that's where he had a big advantage over his rivals, a much bigger advantage on the exit of the corner than he had before it was reintroduced. So initially, drivers were using full traction control, feeling it was easier to drive, and assuming that was the car at its quickest, but it wasn't. It could actually go quicker with less traction control. And Michael was immediately turning the traction control down, having it less stable and therefore faster.
I remember Gary Anderson telling us that was the big difference between Sato and Fisichella in 2002, was that Sato just wanted full traction control, boot the throttle, and couldn't work out why he wasn't as quick as Fisi, who was a bit more finessed, shall we say. But the F1 paddock arrived in Spain off the back of Ralf Schumacher taking the first victory for the Williams-BMW partnership, and Williams' first win since 1997 with you-know-who. It sparked all kinds of talk of if this meant Williams could challenge Ferrari and McLaren for the championship, although everyone at Williams was playing their chances down. Ralf said, we are not title contenders yet. We always thought we'd be able to win a race, but we are not consistent enough on every circuit. Patrick Head praised BMW for being in such a strong position so early in their involvement in F1, that he said the aim was to be championship contenders in 2002. And BMW boss Mario Tyson added, I wouldn't object to more wins, but I think at the moment we are not ready really for the championship. A top team has to be able to deliver, has to be able to deal with every situation. I think it takes a bit more time, and we are happy to save this goal for next season. Ferrari's Ross Brawn wasn't expecting a Williams title challenge either, saying they are not going to be consistent enough over the season. Matt, given that Juan Pablo Montoya could have won in Brazil, and Ralf did win at Imola early in 2001, was Williams in a stronger position early in this season than perhaps they were letting on?
I don't think so, but the Imola one was really interesting. You could sort of put Brazil down to a little bit of crazy improvisational Montoya magic, because that performance just seemed like a even at the time, felt like a sort of one-off great drive from a rookie on the circuit that suited him, just throwing caution to the wind. But the Imola thing, when Ralph took the lead, he came from, I think, third on the grid into the lead at the first corner. You kept expecting during that race for the McLarens to, I think it was only Coulthard running later on, to catch up and put under pressure, but it just never happened. You just controlled the race really dominantly, and that just seemed like a sign that, yeah, Williams was in the position it had been in 5 years earlier, again, suddenly. But no, at the time, there was still a suspicion that it was getting a lot of benefit from the monster BMW engine, and there were going to be some circuits where it couldn't just hide behind that. And it was a tyre war as well, and there wasn't really enough evidence that Michelin was really a season-long, consistent opponent to Bridgestone in the same way as everyone kind of tipping Williams for a title was hoping. But yeah, I can definitely remember at the time, the Ralph win at Imola was a real sign of, actually, this isn't just a kind of throwing it into the lead with a monster start and a great engine, then just holding on under pressure. This is properly controlling a Grand Prix from the front.
I was at that Imola race, sat on the banks at Tosa, and I thought it was quite cool to witness the renaissance of Williams. But let's move on to some F1 politics next, as it was around this time in 2001 that the FIA infamously rubber-stamped an agreement for F1's commercial rights to be handed over to Bernie Ecclestone's company, Sleck, which he co-owned with German media companies Kirch and EMTV for 100 years. This deal came about following pressure from the European Commission that wanted to see a separation of F1's commercial and sporting activities, and it was also unhappy with how close it felt Ecclestone was to the FIA side of things. At the time this deal was done, the FIA and Ecclestone were in the middle of a deal that ran from 1995 to 2010, so the 100-year agreement would only kick in 2011. The 100-year deal cost $313.6 million, which was the original price of $300 million agreed in 2000 plus interest, and it had taken Bernie a while to get the funds in place from his partners. In his book, former FIA President Max Mosley said that negotiating with Bernie was difficult, partly because, in Max's words, what the FIA actually owned in F1 was nebulous. Max added, "Bernie always says we managed to sell him his own business and he only gave us the money for a quiet life." And that was a claim Max called debatable. Max also said the motivation for the deal was because back in 2001, Formula One looked fragile. It was difficult to predict what, if anything, the championship would consist of in the future, and he said the decision was easy at the time, even if it might not have been so easy if it had been known how much F1 would survive and prosper in the years that followed. So, Mark, what did you make of all this? It was a big off-track story, and for the years before Bernie Ecclestone was finally moved aside by Liberty Media, we heard about this 100-year agreement quite a lot, didn't we?
We did. And in hindsight, we could see it was about the control of the championship's future to keep it away from what Max perceived as predator automotive manufacturers. And I think his aim was correct in that. Not that the manufacturers were some evil force, but if you'd put the championship in their control, which ultimately it may have done, they may have bought the commercial rights, it would make the sport very much less robust because they'd have to look after their own interests first. But at the time, it just seemed like an outrageous way of Max and Bernie stitching up the commercial gains of the sport in perpetuity. But over time, I've come to think that it had the benefit of keeping those automotive manufacturers under control while giving the FIA the funding it needed to establish some very worthwhile initiatives. And very often with Max and Bernie, you could see their ultimate aims were right, and you could see what they were trying to do, but that the way they went about getting there wasn't always ethical. But maybe they wouldn't have been able to reach those aims by playing clean. I don't know. But they weren't quite benevolent dictators in how they ran the sport, but they were probably less malevolent than their reputation and than what some of the alternatives might have been.
It's an interesting case of how hindsight can make a difference. Throughout researching stuff for Bring Back V10s, throughout this era, there are constantly stories cropping up of manufacturers trying to gain more control of F1 or set up their own series. I've always been in the camp that it would be disastrous to have the manufacturers fully in control. You can't trust them. You don't know how long they're going to stick around for, because the moment they have a change at board level and or they're not winning, someone's going to pull the plug, and whatever sport they're then in control of could be in big trouble. But let's talk about the manufacturers, because this 100-year deal didn't sit well with the European manufacturers that were in F1 at the time. Ford, Fiat, Mercedes, BMW and Renault made threats, of course, of creating a breakaway series, as they were not happy about F1's commercial rights being handed over for a century. Some of the manufacturers were adamant that they would set up their own series when the Concorde Agreement was up at the end of 2007, as they wanted more of a say in how the championship was run. Jaguar boss Bobby Rahal, that's another Jaguar boss, we've already mentioned Niki Lauda, speaking on behalf of his team's owner Ford, said, "Bernie has made a lot of people in Formula One very wealthy, including himself, but now is the time to be a lot more transparent about the way he conducts his business. This is not posturing, we want action." But Bernie said the manufacturers had their chance to get involved, but they missed the boat and misjudged what was going to happen. And he said they'd be a little silly if they tried to set up their own series. Mosley's book backs up Bernie's claim about the manufacturers missing their chance, as they were invited to make an offer as well. But Mosley said they never produced anything concrete, even when he went back to them in late 2000 to say the door was still open to them because Bernie hadn't got his funding in place yet. So Matt, Mark and I have already had our say on this, really. Where do you stand on your manufacturers? Could they have been trusted if they'd been given more power in F1, or could whatever they wanted to set up themselves have gone ahead and prospered?
Well, I think the simple answer to this is to look ahead 10 years and see how few of them are actually still about. Whether, if they'd owned the championship, if they'd been more inclined to stay to the financial crisis and that sort of thing is a moot point, but I can't see it. And it's like you said, for manufacturers, motorsport is really a luxury, no matter how seriously F1 and motorsport want to take themselves. If your business is building road cars and road machinery, and that is what your workforce is there for, then F1 is an add-on. And there's nothing immoral about having that stance, really. But at the same time, as well as manufacturers coming in and out, manufacturers getting on with each other and collaborating isn't necessarily a guarantee of success either. You can't imagine in this era the standard ECU being adopted between the manufacturers that were around at the time. So no, it was a bad idea at the time, but it only seemed like a good idea because this dictatorship between Max and Bernie looked so much more evil. So it was a kind of a battle between evil and a terrible idea, really.
Let's move away from politics and into the driver market, because we had changes to the lineup for the Spanish Grand Prix. Luciano Berti had found out Jaguar had no intention of keeping him for 2002, so he decided to jump ship to Prost immediately. Jaguar didn't seem too upset by this, immediately promoting Pedro De La Rosa to a race seat alongside Eddie Irvine. Berti said he believed he made the right decision, saying he had nothing against Jaguar, but the best thing for him was to go somewhere that he could see a future, which is a bit awkward considering how much longer Prost existed as an F1 team. De La Rosa perhaps summed it up best by saying the changes were better for everyone, although he added that he wished his first race wasn't in his home country, as it would mean a lot of expectation, but he called for his debut to be taken in the context of the team's capabilities at this stage in our development, saying Jaguar was in transition and using 2001 as a baseline to develop a better car for 2002. Mark, Berti was a highly rated talent in the junior ranks with Jackie Stewart's guidance, but he never raced in F1 again after his big crash for Prost at the Belgian Grand Prix later this season. Given Prost was in plenty of its own turmoil during 2001, was Berti perhaps a little trigger happy to jump ship as soon as he found out he was losing his drive for the following season?
I think there was a lot more going on behind the scenes in terms of the money De La Rosa's sponsors could bring, and Lauda, who is sort of co-running the team with Bobby Rahal, believing the more experienced De La Rosa could give better direction and push Eddie Irvine. Lauda wasn't convinced about Eddie Irvine at that point. And typical Lauda, he wanted it to happen now. If it was better, we can do it now rather than next year, so let's do it. So I'm sure there were discussions between Lauda and his old friend Alain Prost, as well as Prost's former manager, Julian Jacobi, who not coincidentally was also De La Rosa's manager. So I don't actually think Berti had much say in it. I think it just happened and he had to come up with a reason for public consumption.
Yeah, there was a brilliant column at the time written by Matt Bishop when he was back at the Haymarket titles, all about how Jaguar were unimpressed with Irvine and everything else that was going on behind the scenes. So there was quite a lot to this. But as we've hinted there, things weren't exactly rosy at Prost in 2001, but the team was in the news around this time as there were rumours of the one and only Pedro Diniz potentially trying to take the team over. Diniz had taken a stake in Prost at the end of 2000 when he decided to stop racing in F1, and it was believed that the hiring of Bertie was going to be linked to the team's plans to attract more funding from Brazil. Nothing ever came of this, unfortunately, and when Diniz was asked about his association with Prost recently on F1's Beyond the Grid podcast with Tom Clarkson, he said Prost was a good business opportunity, then it turned out it was not so good. The team was in a lot of difficulties, and it was challenging, so didn't really turn out very well. Matt, this is a question that I feel is right up your street. How much did F1 miss out on having a Diniz F1 team? What would that have been like?
I feel like me and Ed Straw missed out on something to talk about for years and years with Pedro Diniz having an F1 team. The thing is, though, as much as Pedro Diniz was a laughable racing driver, less so in the last 3 quarters of his F1 career, I think he might have done a better job of this than Alain Prost, to be honest, given what a state the team got into with Prost. And for Diniz to be around as much money as he was to fund his own F1 career to that degree, he obviously had the business links to make some things happen. It turns out he's quite good at farming now as well in his post-racing career. When he talks about being a good business opportunity, I can imagine the business he had in mind was owning the team for a bit, selling it on to somebody for some more money, probably a manufacturer. But the fact that Diniz looked at Prost and thought, no way, that is too much of a state, kind of says all you need to know about Prost rather than much about Diniz.
Yeah, I think that fits. Sticking with this Bertie De La Rosa driver shuffle, and I should say that the man who lost out at Prost was Gaston Mazzacani. And there was a fun bit I found where Prost were claiming that replacing Mazzacani with Bertie would help them in South America, which seemed to overlook that Mazzacani was from Argentina. But Jaguar's fortunes weren't looking great in their second season in F1, as we've hinted at. Eddie Irvine accepted that unless the teams in front of us get it wrong, we're just chasing the distant chance of a point, adding we're still too slow and it is pretty difficult to do well. Bobby Rahal said team management were brutally aware of the challenge the team faces, and both he and Irvine said hopes were being pinned on a major aerodynamic upgrade that was in the works. We get asked a lot when we're going to do an episode on Jaguar, and Prost for that matter, and we'll take care of one of those later in this series. But Irvine gave some interesting insight into what was going on behind the scenes at Jaguar when he spoke to Steve Ryder for Sky's Legends of F1 series. So let's hear what he had to say.
What was amazing was when you came from Ferrari, it showed me how good Jean Todt was. Because the politics he had to deal with were 10 times the politics that the Ford Motor Company had. And he coped with it. Like, Jean Todt is a complete genius, he really is. And there was no one at that level in Jaguar, and it's such a shame because it was amazing. It was amazing for Formula One, it was amazing for Jaguar, but it all fell apart. Yeah. And they just tried new manager after new manager, and they just never got anyone of the right quality. And whoever came in didn't have the 100% backing of the whole organisation. Yeah. But the actual people in the team were actually good. The mechanics were very good, and the guys, the whole team was good. It was just anyone that had a manager's badge was not good enough. Ford didn't even know what Formula One was, didn't care. Great idea, horribly executed. Yeah.
Mark, interesting stuff from Irvine there, although there were plenty of people at Jaguar who didn't have many kind words to say about him either. How badly was it going for Jaguar in early 2001?
It was just as Eddie says, very bad management, and that had been apparent right from the start of the Jaguar F1 project at the start of 2000. It was the wrong culture, the lack of understanding. I'm not talking about Rail and Lauda here, I'm talking about Detroit management from automotive. The arrogance of thinking because they'd been successful in the corporate world, they'd be performers in F1 without having any grounding and not realizing how it works. So not good at all long-term in terms of prospects. Eddie often didn't say things with grace and could get people's backs up, but about this, he's absolutely right.
Yeah, I think earlier in this series, Gary Anderson said that Eddie Irvine joining Stewart might have been a better fit than Eddie Irvine joining Jaguar. Moving on, unfortunately, around this time in 2001, we got the news that ex-F1 driver Michele Alboreto was killed in a testing accident in an Audi sports car in preparation for the Le Mans 24 Hours. That took place at the Lausitz Ring on its big test circuit. Alboreto was a 5-time race winner in F1, finishing second in the championship to Alain Prost in 1985 with Ferrari. And Ferrari president Luca di Montezemolo led the tributes to the Italian, saying he played an important role in the history of Ferrari and praised him for his intelligence and the way he tackled dealing with problems when developing a car. Now, Mark, we rarely talk about Alboreto on the show, mainly because by the time the V10 era started, his best years were certainly behind him. How good do you think he was in his prime?
And his prime is terrific. In his performance at the 85 Monaco Grand Prix was worthy of any of the greats. He could have won it twice, but for misfortune, it was a mind-blown drive. He wasn't always at that absolute genius level, but in the right circumstances, he could certainly have been a world champion. He could certainly have put that program to get together and led the 84 championship for much of the first half of the season. Very classy driver, very sensitive to the car in the pre-telemetry age. That was sort of gold dust, really, and quick, very quick. And he had a bit of an Indian summer later on with Arrows, and he was still very, very quick then. And there was Alan Jenkins was a big fan of his. The time was at Arrows, and he said there was a test at Silverstone where Alboreto was doing the morning session, and then Alex Caffey the afternoon. And the morning session went quite smoothly, and then Caffey got in the car and shunted it on the first lap, and came back and said the gearbox is the wrong way around. The gate was the wrong way around. So when he was changing up, what he thought was changing up, he was changing down, and it just locked the wheels. And Alan said, really? And he asked Michele, he said, is that right? Is it the wrong way? He said, oh, yeah, I forgot to mention it. So he just worked that out straight away and had driven all morning like that, and then got used to it and forgot to mention it.
It was a different time. Let's just say that. But let's move back to F1 in 2001. Jenson Button was capturing plenty of media attention before and after the Spanish Grand Prix, with a lot of fuss being made about a shoulder injury he'd picked up, which wasn't being helped by Benetton not running power steering on its 2001 car. Button's manager David Robertson created some headlines when he said Button could miss a race if that's what's needed to recover, although Robertson later claimed the British newspapers twisted things round in a way that made it sound worse and all out of proportion. They would never do that. The injury itself was certainly real though, with Button admitting he'd picked up a tweak in Malaysia earlier in the season. He said it hasn't been right since, but I'm not sure what caused it. It's not an excuse for the lap times, but it doesn't make life easy. Button was taking painkillers and wearing a shoulder support to ease the pain, which wasn't helped by how hideously uncompetitive the Benetton was at this stage of the season. He qualified on the back row in Spain, as both he and teammate Giancarlo Fisichella were, as Matt mentioned earlier, out-qualified and out-raced by the Minardi of a Spanish rookie named Fernando Alonso. So Matt, with how badly things were going for Button at Benetton already, could he actually have perhaps done with a 1 or 2 race break just to get him out of that horrible car?
I don't think it would have made any difference. It'd just been an absolute nightmare to come back to. And also, no one would have noticed he wasn't there, probably, because the results and performance were so bad at the time. It's a really sad one to look at now after how exciting his first year was. This second year really could have been a career ender for him. And the fact that you bring up the fact that the British press were seen as twisting stuff, I think that was quite a big part of it. He'd come out of nowhere in mainstream media terms, had this incredible first year at Williams with no expectation whatsoever, just absolutely thriving, become a bit of a tabloid darling. And now he was in a terrible car that he wasn't driving very well, and it was all going downhill so quickly. And this just feels like a kind of a classic overstated 90s, 2000s British tabloid storyline to shout about for a while. That was not helpful. But no, if he could have taken 8 races off that season and come back and still finished 20th in the 9th race.
Poor Jenson. He spoke about how miserable 2001 was in his book, where he wrote, "The car was a total dog to drive. Its 2 biggest flaws were that it was slow, really slow, and Fissy drove it better than me. No getting around that fact." But Jenson also gave a lot of insight into how he was being treated by his new team boss, Flavio Briatore, who was back in charge at Benetton ahead of the team being fully taken over by Renault for 2002. Button said in his book, "At first, Flavio was great company. However, it soon became apparent that he expected me to win races, which in that car was an impossibility. And when I didn't win races, he started being no fun. He was especially forthright with the media, especially when you'd had a poor race, which was pretty much every race that season. I read some of his comments that year and thought they were petulant, childish and unnecessary. And worse than that, they really got to me. Flavio's hostility shook me up. Nothing on track scared me, but Flavio gave me the screaming heebie-jeebies. My inability to get to grips with it, at least at first, put me in a very dark place. I was scared of not performing, which meant that I didn't perform, which made me even more scared of not performing. I was thinking I would never pull out of the slump. Button also wrote that being beaten by Alonso's Minardi that weekend was humiliating. But Mark, let's move past Flavio's expectation that anyone should win races in that 2001 Benetton. What did you make specifically of the way Briatore was handling Button during this difficult time?
It made him look a bit one-dimensional, not the great manager he could be. The whole thing about Jenson's first year was a supreme confidence in his own ability he carried, and that sort of fed on itself. And then he arrives at a car that just is completely unsuited to his style of driving. And in that situation, you know that the driver can do good stuff because you've already seen it. It really needs to have his confidence built back up while they sort out a car that works for him. The last thing you need to be doing is destroying the confidence, because that's giving you no chance to access what you already know is there. So he managed the team wonderfully well. If you talk to anybody that worked at Benetton Renault at that time, and said he was the most fantastic manager, and he just basically let people, you put his trusted lieutenants in charge and let them do the job, and very little interference. But if he took against a driver, he could be horribly counterproductive. Alex Wurz, before Jenson, had experienced it, and Jarno Trulli would afterwards. But if you talk to Fernando Alonso or Mark Webber, they would just tell you he was fantastic because he was for them. So yeah, there was just that blind spot. If he took against a driver, he made it worse, and it's just definitely a blind spot in his managerial capabilities.
Let's go on with the track action then. And while Michael Schumacher took pole for Ferrari, the interesting story from qualifying was Mika Hakkinen getting onto the front row after turning his traction control off. Hakkinen said that by turning it off, he could fix a couple of parts of the lap where he had understeer by playing with the throttle, although he also admitted to losing some time in turn 5 when he lost the rear end. Schumacher said he could see how running without traction control for a qualifying lap might be an advantage, but he wouldn't expect that to be the case over a race distance. So Matt, was this revelation from Hakkinen perhaps a sign that driver aids were overrated?
It was a great headline, wasn't it? In a point of everyone slating them. Like we were discussing earlier, it wasn't as simple as an on-off switch that took away all your wheel spin and let you just drive flat out the entire lap. There was more nuance to it. You could use them in degrees, and some kind of balance of the driver aids helping, but the driver's own inputs being part of it when necessary was ideal. And I think that's all Hakkinen's saying here. But also need to remember that this was 2001. What seemed very high tech at the time probably really, really wasn't, and was relatively primitive. And thinking about how in modern F1, how the settings are all so highly tuned, and how many adjustments on the steering wheel a driver will make to make a hybrid system work the right way for them, I can imagine there was a lot less variation and kind of tunability possible with traction control at this point. So traction control was probably in a relatively basic form compared to the potential it would have had, say, 10, 15 years on. And I think Hakkinen's line just shows that it wasn't as simple a kind of evil saviour of the talentless driver as it was being presented.
What followed on race day was a classic Schumacher-Hakkinen battle, the likes we'd not seen for a few months since 2000 when they've been doing it all the time. They streaked away from everybody, with Hakkinen stopping later during both pit stop phases and emerging from his second stop having taken the lead. Shortly after this, Schumacher slowed dramatically with a vibration, which Ferrari couldn't trace the cause of, but they decided not to bring him in for another set of tyres and just focused on nursing the car home. There were some fears that it could be a suspension problem, as that had put Rubens Barrichello out of the race in the other Ferrari. That meant Hakkinen cleared off into the distance, starting that final lap, as Mark mentioned earlier, with a 42-second lead. But even that wasn't enough when his clutch failed and his car ground to a flaming halt halfway round the lap. Hakkinen called it a catastrophic moment as he was on course for his 4th win in a row at Barcelona and was hoping to kickstart his 2001 season, and he said he would need to get a punch bag in the motorhome to let out his frustration. Schumacher went up to Hakkinen after the race to apologise for what had happened to him. In an article for the McLaren website in 2015, Hakkinen said Schumacher told him he could take no joy in winning a race like that, and Mika added, "It was a kind gesture, but I was inconsolable." So Mark, let's focus on the part of the race before these two great drivers had any car problems. How good was this battle up until the second pit stops, when Mika finally comes out in the lead in what really was an old school refueling flat out race?
Yeah, it was shaping up beautifully up until that point, until the point where Michael had to back off. And I think it could have gone either way, but Hakkinen was pounding in the laps around the stop. So he looked really on it and really up for it. And it was going to be fascinating to see how it played out. It was all set to be one of those classic duels between that we'd seen so many times before.
Now, also in that McLaren website article, Hakkinen talked about his struggles in 2001 in general. He said it was a very frustrating year, adding, "I began to feel imprisoned, suffocated by bad fortune. I found it difficult to keep my cool. Sometimes I felt like screaming. Perhaps I began to close myself off. People in the press wrote that it looked as though I was no longer trying, that I'd given up. I had not given up at all, of course, but the results still refused to come." And Mark, Mika did bag a couple of wins later in the year at Silverstone and Indy. But do you think a win this early in the year would have made any difference to how the rest of his season played out?
I think Mika was in a difficult place mentally, and I think it had started with his accident in Melbourne, and I always, because I mean, although he wasn't hurt there, it was a scary experience for someone who had always been killed a few years before, because it was from inside, it was looking like it was, it was going to repeat. And I always wonder what part that Spain retirement played in his retirement decision, because he was in a negative frame of mind coming in. And I wonder if that might have just lifted him enough, because if he'd won there, he might have felt he had a tilt at the title. But after this, there really wasn't. The Michael and Ferrari were really getting a good run. I wonder, with a chance of fighting for the title, those questions in his mind, those troubling things that were in his mind, I wonder if he could have kept them at bay. And maybe he was less able to do so once those prospects were gone. I think it took a lot more out of Mika fighting for a title, and I think he referenced it once in 2000, saying how horrible 99 had been, and that he really didn't want to have to put himself through that again. I think it took a lot of mental strain, and that's where Michael was so strong over so many years. So all that retirement of Barcelona just seemed like a routine, dramatic moment, just a standard racing drama. I think it may have had more significance than that.
McLaren had more drama on its plate earlier in the afternoon, as before the formation lap, David Coulthard's car had stalled. It later emerged that Coulthard had triggered a glitch in the launch control system by not pulling away with 100% throttle applied. But straight after the race, Ron Dennis was interviewed by ITV and suggested Coulthard had had a bit of brain fade. Coulthard took that badly, as you might expect, and responded saying that Ron had suffered brain fade by making that comment without speaking to DC or his engineer first. Adrian Newey defended Coulthard, saying it was unfair to blame him and that it was a situation McLaren hadn't properly rehearsed, but the system probably should have coped with it. Dennis later offered a clarification in a team statement, saying, "Based on an initial analysis, we felt that David was responsible for stalling on the dummy grid, but closer scrutiny confirmed that a glitch in the software was at fault." Coulthard wrote in his book that Ron did apologise to him in person, and it's perhaps telling that DC only briefly references what I think a lot of us remember as quite a famous public falling out between him and Ron, so I don't think it left much of a scar. Coulthard then had to start the race from the back, where he got caught up in a first lap collision, broke his front wing, then raced his way back to 5th after pitting for repairs at the end of lap 1. So Matt, is there any way we can have some sympathy for Ron Dennis here, or is this just terrible judgment on his part?
I'm just trying to think of any circumstance which I could feel sympathy for Ron Dennis, and I'm really
it's
struggling.
Not easy, is it?
It's no, it's not. I mean, okay, you've got to respect everything he achieved, but wow, the guy has a talent for infuriating people, especially unfavoured drivers in his own team. No, this was really badly handled. I rewatched the first part of the 2001 season before this podcast, and one of the things that really stuck out to me was in Brazil when Coulthard won and Ron was interviewed on the pit wall straight afterwards. Okay, maybe he didn't want TV there at that moment, but his response was so graceless about the victory. And that was a spectacular win. DC was amazing in that race. But Ron's attitude around it was just that it was coming across like McLaren had a God-given right to always be winning races with the best drivers, and he couldn't get into his head that Ferrari was now in control and McLaren was up against it. And he hadn't been. There's lots of times over Coulthard's time at McLaren when Ron wasn't that positive about him publicly. It's amazing that they had such a long relationship, considering. So no, this was 100% poor judgment, and you can't imagine Ron having been like that had Hakkinen still on the grid.
No, I thought that as well. But Hakkinen's late retirement meant the podium was completed by Montoya's Williams and Jacques Villeneuve's BAR. This was Montoya's first finish in F1, and he'd come through to second from a disappointing 12th on the grid without using traction control, as Williams didn't think they could trust the new system. Montoya said he wasn't expecting to be on a podium in Spain because he'd found the Williams tricky to drive, and he felt the McLarens and Ferraris were in a different league. He added, "We never really got the car handling the way I wanted. It was sliding a lot." He also said that he backed off after teammate Ralf Schumacher spun out of the race, and Ralf was only 15 seconds off the lead when he said something quite strange happened to put him in the gravel after 20 laps. Mark, given all we'd seen from Montoya over those early races in F1 and the reputation he came in with, was this a bit of an underwhelming way for him to get his first podium?
Yeah, I suppose so. It's nothing like as exciting as Brazil. But it was a result on the board, I think that's how they probably looked at it, as a platform to build on. It took the pressure off him a little bit, because if he'd got to that stage still without a finish, it would have just gradually started ratcheting up. But Montoya was like this, as it turned out, even when he was more experienced, with very high highs and some low dips, and he could just not get on with the car all weekend and just sort of say, well, it's the car's fault, I don't care, it's just wrong, and that would be that weekend written off. And so, yeah, it was at least a foundation, let's say, in terms of a result, and there was a lot of great stuff to come.
Yeah, agreed. Now, interestingly, earlier in the weekend, Coulthard had a bit to say about Montoya, believing that the Colombian's arrival in F1 was being sensationalised by the media. DC, who, it must be said, refers to Montoya in his book as the chubby fella, more than once he says that in the book. DC said in Spain, he has F1 testing experience, European racetrack experience, and he went off to America. I think the press try to be sensational about him. I'm not taking anything away from him, but you've got to keep it real. Now, Matt, I don't know about you, but I'd been aboard the Montoya hype train for a while by this point. Was DC right that maybe some of us were getting a bit overexcited, or did Montoya warrant the kind of buzz he was generating in early 2001?
DC was 100% absolutely wrong in every way at that point. You could criticize Montoya for being unrefined and all over the place, but you couldn't underplay the excitement around him. Now, I've been firmly aboard the Montoya hype train since a Silverstone Formula 3000 qualifying session I was spectating it, and just the body language of the car was so much more aggressive than anybody else, not just in the cornering, but how he was like massively backing up the pack to get himself clear of traffic, which was outrageous the way he was doing it. But that was Montoya, and he made quite heavy weather of winning the Formula 3000 title in the end. But his 2 seasons in what was at that point called Champ Car briefly were fantastic. To win the title in kart at the first attempt in '99 against that strong a field as a rookie with no oval experience since very low level racing at the start of his career, that was a genuinely incredible feat. I would rate that as the best title won by a Ganassi driver in IndyCar, genuinely. And I think in the Lola package in 2000, he was fantastic, even though the car kept breaking and certainly wasn't the best chassis on the grid anymore. So, yeah, even before he got to F1, there were loads of reasons to be so excited about Montoya. I've been an enormous Alex Zanardi fan and seen that go horribly wrong. And before that, I'd been a kart fan seeing Andretti's arrival go horribly wrong. So I was quite anxious to see if Montoya would translate. And yeah, he was qualifying way off Ralph at this point. But in every race, there was a sign of something special going on. Like, okay, he threw it off the road at the first corner in Melbourne, but he was outbraking 2 cars down the middle through a narrowing gap at the time. He qualified a long way off Ralph pace-wise in Malaysia, but he learned the circuit in FP3 because his Friday barely happened for him. And obviously there was Interlagos, and I can't remember Imola in detail, but I'm sure he had like one good moment there in between being slower than Ralph and the car braking. But this was it. Every weekend there was a fiery thing to get excited about. And okay, he sort of ambled his way through to second in this race, but he still got second from 12th on the grid, ahead of a lot of cars who qualified ahead of him. So yeah, I was very much aboard the hype train. I was convinced he was going to win 3 titles at least at this point. I was obviously going to be wrong about that. You could tell he was all over the place, but he was exciting, and you could not deny that. He was worth being a bit sensational about.
And there's a good little clip there for all the people that ask us when we're going to do Bring Back Kart. So we've talked about it for a little bit there, and I'm certainly not complaining about that. If we're looking for something spectacular that Montoya did in this race, I think it was his start. He goes from 12th to sort of 6th or 7th by the first corner. But Montoya was on for a podium finish even if Hakkinen hadn't broken down. So the main beneficiary here was Villeneuve, who claimed BAR's first F1 podium in its 38th start. This came after a shambolic qualifying session for Villeneuve, as on his first run, he said his rear brakes were not attached properly, and on his second run, the car was running 10 kilos overweight. So he started 7th, but he felt the car was quick enough to be as high as 5th on the grid if he'd had a clean session. Villeneuve didn't use launch control at the start, but he got off the line okay, and it was actually down at turn 1 where he lost ground. He admitted that he braked too early and then woke up when Montoya swept past him, having started 5 places behind him. At the end of the race, Villeneuve said he wasn't sure if he was passing Hakkinen's stricken car for position, as he couldn't tell how many times McLaren had lapped him in the race. But fortunately, with Schumacher so far back, Villeneuve did have time to unlap himself and get around again to pass Hakkinen for that 3rd place. Mark, a new F1 team taking its first podium in its 38th race is basically unthinkable now. Things were a bit different 20 years ago. Did this feel like a significant result for BAR, or given the good fortune involved, would that have been overplaying it?
It seemed like progress was being made at this early stage of the 2001 season. But in hindsight, no. I mean, the team had hit a ceiling. It had come in 99 as this all-new entity, sort of buying out what had been the Tyrrell team. And it was all new and chaotic among a lot of hype. And it really under-delivered in that first season. But it made a big step up in 2000, which is when Honda came on board properly. And they put together a pretty solid 2000 season. A lot of 4th places for Jacques, and really it needed you were looking for the next step, and that next step never came. In this incarnation of the team, that 2000 season was the best it would be until 2004, when they did come up with a really good car. So yeah, it was just really a false dawn, I think, and it could have been. I think it was probably looked on at the time as this is evidence that the team's still going places. This result, but it wasn't really.
No, I remember being very excited about it at the time, ignoring all the context really. But looking back at it now, it wasn't a sign of anything during that first iteration of BAR, which of course was Craig Pollock era. The timing of that first podium felt significant as well, because reports had surfaced in the British newspapers saying that British American Tobacco had called in investment bankers to analyse the feasibility of selling off a stake in the team. BAT put out a statement denying this, saying BAT wishes to emphasise its continuing commitment to BAR. The group has no current intention of reducing its equity interest in BAR, and any suggestion that BAT is considering a sell-off is inaccurate and mischievous. Team boss Craig Pollock referenced that speculation after the podium finish, saying, "Whenever there are rumours, it's good to put them to bed with a result like this." Pollock also admitted BAR had revised its targets for the season in reaction to seeing how strong Ferrari, McLaren and Williams were. He said, "We had a very bad start to the year, which was difficult to accept, but we know we have a lot of work to get up there with the big boys, and this is just the start. We are in our third year, and I don't think we can say we are a young team. We can't use excuses anymore. At the beginning of the year, we were thinking of finishing third or better in the championship, and having seen where Williams, McLaren and Ferrari are, it will be very difficult to get in there. Fourth or better would be more than acceptable." BAR had finished 5th in 2000, but tied on points with Benetton in 4th place, and in the end they would slip to 6th in 2001. So Matt, lastly, ignoring how 2001 turned out for BAR, was this a rare dose of realism for the team, especially for Pollock to speak like this after such what could have been used as a landmark result? We actually heard Pollock saying, "No, we're going to have to revise our goals because the big teams have moved away from us."
Yeah, it's quite refreshing, isn't it? I had no idea from memory that he reacted in that way. I was expecting the opposite. I do think by this time, I was going to say the hype had quietened down, but the way Pollock uses the phrase "or better" in that quote is a little bit ominous. You know, the noise before BAR came in was offensively deafening about what they'd achieve at the outset, and then 99 was the kind of punishment they got for that hubris. But like Mark said, 2000 was great. I returned to Jacques Villeneuve fandom in 2000. I think that was up there with 96 and 98 as a genuinely great season from him. I don't include 97 as a great Villeneuve season, sorry.
A debate for another
But yeah,
time.
they were indeed they were an impressive team in 2000, and it did seem like they're on the cusp of something. And you could look at that season and think, okay, McLaren and Ferrari out of reach. Well, who's going to be third? BAR maybe, Williams in a sort of state of flux, Jordan in there as well. Yeah, you could put them in that conversation. But Pollock saying we were thinking third or better at the start of the year. They were seeing that after 2000 they had a launch pad to attack McLaren and Ferrari. Nah, that's like old school start of the team BAR talk. But yeah, it's I think as well he couldn't help but see how inherited this result was. I think for both Montoya and Villeneuve, it was a very enjoyable podium to see. They were two of my favourite drivers up there, but no one could say those were kind of massively well-earned results or particular performance high points for the drivers and teams involved.
Well, if we were looking to end on a high with this episode, it doesn't get much higher than finishing up with a lucky podium for Villeneuve and BAR. So that's where we'll draw a line under Spain 2001. Thanks to Mark and to Matt for joining us. I'm sure we'll have you both on again very soon. Remember to get your questions in for our series finale episodes, where you can ask us anything about F1's V10 era from 1989 to 2005. You can submit them using the hashtag BringBackV10s on Twitter. Email them to bringbackv10s@the-race.com, or submit a question in a 5-star podcast review on Apple Podcasts if you think we've earned it. For the second episode in a row, we're promising you the story of the 2004 Williams FW26 is coming next, where we'll revisit the car best known as the Walrus.